You can't really fake your subcommunication when you're speaking to a girl. It is something very difficult to fake it till you make it. And I've noticed that it's kind of been taught in the community. There's a lot of coaches that just say, look, you can fake it till you make it. But I would argue that your subcommunications cannot be faked. There's no hack to that unless you do some seriously deep work. And that serious deep work might take you out of the game for 6 months or even longer, depending on how off your subcommunications are. But before we kick it off, I'm Dave, and this channel is dedicated to giving you no BS, novel dating advice for the modern man. Top link in the description to get some coaching with me. Subcommunications, so important, I think. And there's two types of types of guys out there really that are using the wrong subcommunications and the wrong strategy of cold approach, which doesn't really mesh with their subcommunications. And the first type is, well, someone that's new, someone that's kind of new. They're kind of nervous. This is kind of, I would say, the most obvious, and I dare say the majority of guys, they're not in the community too long. And they're not real. They haven't put in the time and put in the work to have that exposure training. I have noticed quite a few coaches have this problem as well with subcommunications. They're nervous. They're not quite centered as a man when they're speaking to the girl, and their nervousness, what they're doing is they're speaking a little bit too fast, and you can just visibly see that they're nervous. And so what they do is they try to overcompensate by pretending that they're cool. They try to overcompensate with their body language or having a deep voice. I saw a guy who's a coach, a relatively big name, and he was like, yeah, and he was like on a bench doing an infield, and he was over the top going, yeah. But what I could see was a guy that was overcompensating with his deep voice, because deep down he was extremely nervous and had extreme approach anxiety. So his anxiety was trying to overcompensate, and unless you are one of those super duper good looking guys, you're not really going to be able to overcome that. Sometimes it will work in your favor if you are nervous, because they will find it cute. But I would argue that there's no real hack. Another infield that I saw, there was a bunch of guys that had this hack where they were mostly a little bit nervous, and they're relatively new to game, but they're coaches, typical. They were nervous, and their hack was, as soon as the girl hooks and stops and starts talking to you, they lean up against the wall and put their leg up against the wall and pretend that, yeah, it's like, this is my hooking. It's like they lean up against the wall and they put their foot up against the wall and lean up against it like one leg, as if they're overcompensating with their body language. That's another way of overcompensating when their subcommunications are so far off. They're trying to hack the system. And I would argue that a lot of women can see straight through that. Also, when you're trying to overcompensate by focusing on yourself, your voice, your tonality, your body language, and you're nervous, I would argue that that's more of a deeper problem that you need to get handled through exposure training far before you start trying to put a band-aid over a wound, because this band-aid of trying to hack it with tonality and body language, it's really just a band-aid. And most people can see straight through that. I would argue that most women would be able to see straight through that as well. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, I would argue that there's a lot of, say, hard case guys that have got that exposure training, and they've pumped out so many approaches that the rejection and the girl is not really an issue to them. It's not a problem. And I would argue that there's a lot of hard cases out there that get a lot more rejection than a lot of the coaches out there that are less likely to care about rejection than the coaches that are out there trying to pick up advice. And let me explain. So you'll see a lot of real hard cases that have been at it for years. They know the theory back to front. They've got a lot of exposure training under their belt. And what they do is a lot of them go direct. And the reason why they go direct, it is the same as having poor subcommunications and using your verbals to compensate the band-aid, right? As previously we said, the guys that are too nervous, they're leaning up against the wall, trying to use body language. The guys that are too nervous, they're trying to have a deeper voice because they're nervous. Actually, I did an infield breakdown of Tay Social. You can check that out. Tay Social focuses on his deep voice, and he also openly says that he's nervous a lot of the time. So he tries to compensate with the deep voice. I think that's quite common as well. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, guys that are not nervous and they're a little bit dead to the game. It doesn't really matter. They can approach 5 girls and they're just low energy. It doesn't really matter to them. They don't really care anymore. They're the guys that are spamming the streets all the time, and because their subcommunications are so far off and they have never really done any deep work on themselves, they're always just looking for a band-aid solution. They're the same guys that are asking, what is your opener? They're the guys that are not always the opener, but they're talking about game a lot, and they're very critical. They think they know everything, but they've never actually put in a lot of time on themselves, and so they have no problem with this exposure training approaching a lot of girls, and you see them going direct. And the reason why they're going direct is, so a guy that would be going direct would be very, I would say, more likely to be a bit more sexual, more likely to be a higher mate value guy that's punching down, approaching girls that are arguably beneath him on the mate value scale, and he's actually attracted to them. So if he's going direct, sometimes guys can't help themselves, especially in the nightclubs. And when he's going direct, it matches, you see? His subcommunications are on point. There's no inconsistencies there. They match because he actually is attracted to the girl. But a lot of the hard cases that have been doing this for years, they're not really attracted to the girl. They're not really that into the girl because they haven't really got that much success, and they can't really envision something happening in the future because they can't really see. It's like the unknown for them. They haven't really been there. I would also argue that these guys also, their low energy is because they're dead to it. So they go over there like direct. Hey, I think you're really cute. I just wanted to come meet you. But they're just dead. You can see it in their eyes. They're dead. They're low energy. They're not really into it at all. They don't. It seems like they don't even want to be there, to be honest. And they're trying to overcompensate for them being dead and approaching. They could approach 10 girls at a time and still be like, yeah, I think you're really hot, because what they're trying to overcompensate is the energy level is so low. They're sub-communicating that they don't even want to be there. Then they're overcompensating with their verbals up here, saying, yeah, I think you're really sexy, I think you're really hot. But they're saying it like this, like, yeah, I think you're really sexy, I think you're really hot, and they're dead to the world, and they're trying to match it up, but it's just inconsistent. Their sub-communications are off. And I would argue that if you are low energy, I would try to match the verbals with it. Just try to be consistent. I would argue that if you are super duper nervous, just go with it. At least don't try to overcompensate by doing the opposite to compensate and try match it up. Because my argument is that it's not real consistent with who you are, and women can see through that. So if you're nervous, be nervous. If you're dead to the world, don't be paying compliments and telling them how sexual you are when really you're just like, you're dead. If you are really you got a lot of energy, you're nervous and you're over the top, just be that guy, because During the day, you're going to have fluxes in your energy levels, and if game is a lifestyle for you, you're going to be meeting girls when you're low energy, and you're going to be meeting girls when you're high energy. But if you are low energy when direct, and then you're high energy in direct, this doesn't match. But I would argue that you could be going all the way through the spectrum during the day, and that would also diversify your approach, and your subcommunications will be on point, and I would argue that you would get better results over time if you did it that way. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. I hope it's not a little bit too complicated. It makes sense to me. I see it all the time, and I think it's something that I wanted to talk about. So hopefully that made sense to you guys. It made perfect sense to me. If you have a problem, send me a message and I'll hopefully clarify it. I'll see you guys in the next video.